What if the walls of your home knew your darkest secrets? The question lingered in Emily Carter's mind as she stood in the foyer of the old Victorian house, its tall windows staring back at her like hollow eyes. The realtor had called it charming, though the smell of dust and something faintly metallic curled in her nose as she stepped inside. Her husband, Daniel, carried the last box in, grunting, while their teenage daughter, Claire, trailed behind, face lit by the glow of her phone. "This place is huge," Daniel said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I still can't believe we got it for that price." Emily smiled weakly, though she didn't quite share his enthusiasm. The house was far too cheap for its size and history. Rumors had circulated in town, whispers of strange occurrences, unexplained accidents, and neighbors who claimed they heard voices through the walls. But the Carters had brushed it off. People always liked to add stories to old houses, and they needed a fresh start. Claire groaned. "Do we have to live here? It looks like something out of a horror movie." "Exactly," Daniel said with mock excitement, ruffling her hair. "Our very own haunted mansion." But Emily didn't laugh. There was something unsettling in the air, something she couldn't name. The first night passed quietly enough. Boxes cluttered the living room, the kitchen echoed with emptiness, and their beds were still wrapped in plastic. Emily couldn't sleep. The wind howled against the shutters, and the old pipes moaned as if the house were alive, shifting and breathing around them. At around 2:13 a.m., she rolled over and froze. Something about the wallpaper. The wall across from the bed seemed different. In the faint glow of the streetlight outside, Emily noticed the pattern had shifted. The faded roses and twisting vines weren't in the same places they had been earlier. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was exhaustion. But no, the vines now spelled words, faint but deliberate, twisting up from the baseboard to the ceiling. "I know what you did." Her heart lurched. Emily sat up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. She blinked again, but the words melted back into roses and vines, as if they had never existed. She shook Daniel awake, her voice trembling. "Dan, wake up. Look at the wall." He groaned, rubbing his face. "It's the middle of the night, Em." "What is it?" "The wallpaper, it changed." "I swear it." She stopped when she looked again. "Nothing but roses. No words." Daniel sighed. "You're just tired. Moving stress. Go back to sleep." But Emily couldn't. Long after Daniel's breathing steadied, she lay awake, staring at the walls that seemed to watch her back. The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream. Exhaustion. Her imagination. But as she made coffee in the kitchen, she noticed Claire staring at the wall near the dining table, her face pale. "What's wrong, honey?" Emily asked, setting down the mugs. Claire's eyes didn't leave the wallpaper. "It said my name." Emily froze. "What do you mean?" Claire lifted a trembling hand and pointed. "Right there." It spelled Claire in the flowers. "I saw it." Emily's stomach sank. Maybe it was just. But then she saw it too. The looping vine shifted subtly, curling to form her daughter's name like handwriting in green ink. And then, just as quickly, it rearranged into ordinary roses again. Claire backed away. "I told you." Emily tried to keep calm. "Don't tell your dad." "Not yet. He'll think we're crazy." That night, Emily couldn't shake the unease. She sat alone in the living room, flipping through a half-unpacked box of books when the wallpaper began to move again, right before her eyes. This time, the words formed slowly, like an invisible pen etching them into the pattern. "Your husband's secret." Emily's mouth went dry. She turned toward the stairs, listening. Daniel was upstairs, brushing his teeth. Claire was in her room. She looked back at the wall, but the words had already melted away. Her husband's secret? What secret? Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by dreams of peeling wallpaper, whispering vines, and hands reaching through cracks in the plaster. At 3:07 a.m., she woke with a start. The wallpaper across from the bed was different again. The roses twisted into something jagged, sharp, unmistakable. Someone will die. Emily clutched her chest, heart hammering. She wanted to scream, to wake Daniel, but her voice wouldn't come. Her body shook with cold as she stared at the shifting wall. Then, slowly, a new word appeared beneath the message, curling in vines like a cruel afterthought. Soon. And then the roses returned, innocent and delicate, as though they had never betrayed their secret. Emily couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. She knew what she had seen. The wallpaper wasn't just watching. It was warning. The wallpaper had grown darker overnight. Not just in color, but in mood, in presence. Claire swore she felt the walls pulsing faintly, like the paper was breathing. By morning, new phrases appeared, longer, clearer, and disturbingly specific. At first, they seemed like fragmented diary entries. I hate the way he chooses food. I wish she'd stop pretending everything's fine. I don't love him anymore. The words snaked across the wallpaper in Claire's handwriting, though she had never written them. She could see her own neat loops, the same tilt, the same hesitation in the letter R. Mom? Lily whispered, standing in the doorway to the dining room that morning, eyes wide. Why is my name on the wall? Claire's stomach dropped. She turned slowly. Across the faded floral pattern of the dining room wallpaper, new sentences shimmered faintly, fresh as dew. Lily thinks about running away every night. She wonders if anyone would notice. Lily was pale, clutching the strap of her backpack like a lifeline. I never, she looked at her mother, eyes shining with tears. It's lying. It has to be lying. But Claire wasn't sure. The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was the guilty flicker that passed across her daughter's face, gone in an instant, but enough to tell Claire that the wallpaper wasn't entirely wrong. That night, after putting Lily to bed and pretending everything was fine, Claire sat in the living room staring at the walls. She refused to turn the lights off, as though illumination could keep the house honest. The silence was so deep she could hear her own heartbeat. And then, faint, almost imperceptible, the wallpaper began to change again. This time, she saw her husband's name. Mark is thinking about her again. He still dreams of the one he lost. He wishes Claire would never know. The words cut through her like glass. She felt her throat tighten, her breath catching. She wanted to tear the wallpaper down with her bare hands, to rip it apart until the lies, or truths, were gone. But her hands wouldn't move. Instead, she backed away, inch by inch, until her legs hit the coffee table. That's when she noticed something else. The text wasn't confined to the walls anymore. It had begun to crawl onto the ceiling, thin letters trailing like smoke, sprawling outward, filling the house. Claire ran to the front door. She twisted the knob, it didn't budge. Panic surged through her veins. She pulled harder, yanked, even screamed, but the lock wouldn't move. The air thickened, heavy with the musty scent of paper and dust. And then the writing shifted again, right in front of her eyes, scrawling fresh letters across the wall beside the door. She won't leave tonight. The words were wet, glistening, as though written in ink that hadn't yet dried. Claire stumbled backward, heart pounding. She knew what it meant. The house wasn't only recording thoughts anymore. It was predicting actions. It was sealing fates. And as she stood there frozen, she heard it, the sound of whispering. Not from her family's rooms, but from the walls themselves, as though hundreds of unseen mouths were murmuring secrets they'd never meant to share. The voices layered over each other, low and urgent, impossible to decipher but growing louder by the second. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, but the whispers burrowed through her skull. she screamed, collapsing against the wall. The whispers stopped instantly. On the wallpaper behind her, a single new sentence appeared in thick, dripping letters. "Tomorrow, one of them will not wake up." Claire barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house, every faint sigh of wind against the windows sounded like the whispers returning. She lay awake, staring at the faint glow of the wallpaper patterns in the dark, her chest tight with fear. That sentence wouldn't leave her mind. "Tomorrow, one of them will not wake up." It clung to her thoughts like cobwebs, choking her with possibilities. Was it Lily? Was it Mark? Or, God forbid, was it her? When dawn finally seeped into the house, pale and cold, Claire rushed into Lily's room. Her daughter lay sprawled across the bed, tangled in blankets, her chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of sleep. Relief flooded Claire so strongly it brought tears to her eyes. She touched Lily's shoulder, needing to feel warmth, needing to confirm life, and Lily stirred with a soft groan. Claire let out a shaky breath. Then she moved to the master bedroom, heart hammering. Mark was there, snoring lightly, his hand draped across the empty side of the bed where Claire hadn't slept. She stood over him, waiting, almost desperate to see his chest rise again. When it did, she nearly collapsed. Everyone was alive. The prophecy was wrong, or perhaps, she told herself desperately, it wasn't prophecy at all. Just some twisted trick of the house. But when she stumbled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, she saw it, new writing stretched across the wallpaper, bold, sprawling, impossible to ignore. Not yet. But soon. The words made her throat dry. It was as though the house knew she doubted it, knew she'd hoped it was wrong. The message felt smug, alive, watching her. The day passed under a suffocating cloud of tension. Claire couldn't stop staring at her family, Lily with her earbuds in, staring at her phone with an intensity that felt like escape, Mark clattering pans in the kitchen, trying to ignore the way Claire kept glancing at him. She couldn't tell them about the prophecy. How could she? How could she say out loud that the house had promised one of them wouldn't wake? If she gave it voice, it would be real. By evening, her nerves were frayed raw. She jumped at every noise, every flicker of shadow. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway made her flinch when it chimed. At dinner, no one spoke much. The wallpaper seemed to lean closer, its faded floral patterns pressing in on them like listening ears. And then, right as Claire was lifting her glass of water, Mark muttered something under his breath. It was soft, almost a whisper, but she caught it. "I wish I could have saved her." Her hand froze, the glass trembling. "What did you say?" she asked sharply, her voice cracking. Mark's fork clinked against the plate. "What?" He looked startled, defensive. "You said something," Claire insisted, her pulse racing. "You said, you wish you could have saved her." "Who are you talking about?" The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Mark stared at her, his face pale, lips parting as though to answer, but before he could, Lily let out a sharp gasp. Both parents turned. Lily was staring at the dining room wall, her face gone ghost white. Fresh words were scrawling themselves across the wallpaper, letter by letter, in real time. They curved in jagged arcs, like the handwriting of someone in pain. "She will drown in her sleep tonight." Claire's blood went cold. She grabbed Lily, pulling her away from the wall as if it might reach out and seize her. Mark stood, knocking his chair backward. His face was drained of all color. "That's it," Claire whispered, trembling. "We're not staying here another night. We'll leave, now. Tonight." But as she darted toward the door, clutching Lily's wrist, she saw it. Across the front door, the words appeared in thick, black strokes. "There is no leaving. Not until the truth is told." That night, Sarah could not sleep. The whispers of wallpaper seemed to hum in her ears even though she was in bed with the lights off, staring at the faint glow of the street lamp through the curtains. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that word in dripping red strokes, fire. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe Emma had just been scared and mistaken. Maybe the patterns on the wall were just old stains. Maybe it was all in their heads. But Sarah knew deep down it wasn't. This house wasn't passive. It wasn't just recording thoughts, it was feeding on them, twisting them, and now it was pushing forward into the future. In the early morning hours, Sarah gave up trying to sleep. She wandered into the hallway, only to find David already standing there, arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring at the walls like they might spring to life. His eyes looked darker, shadowed, like he hadn't slept either. "You saw it too," Sarah whispered. David nodded once, his jaw set. "It knows. About everything. Not just secrets, it knows what's coming." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. He wasn't questioning anymore. He was admitting what they had both feared, that this house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It wasn't a spirit or ghost. It was alive in its own way. Observing. Recording. And, worst of all, anticipating. The kids woke up restless. Emma refused to go into the living room, insisting she'd heard the walls breathing in the night. Ben, quieter than usual, avoided her eyes, and when Sarah pressed him, he muttered something about dreams of fire before clamping his lips shut. Sarah noticed something else. His knuckles were raw, scraped, as though he'd been clawing at something in his sleep. But when she asked, he only shrugged and went silent again. It was as if the house wasn't just predicting, they were beginning to play their parts in whatever story it was writing. That afternoon, Sarah decided to test it. She stood in front of the wallpaper in the upstairs hallway and whispered to it, like speaking to a confessional. "I'm not afraid of you," she said softly, even though her voice trembled. "You don't know everything." The wallpaper shifted. Slowly, faint letters began to bloom like bruises in the pale pattern. Sarah stepped closer, heart hammering, as words scrawled across the wall in an uneven hand. "Yes. We do." She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. It had answered her directly. Not a memory, not a secret, but a response. That was the moment she realized they weren't alone in their house, and they weren't even in control of it. Something behind those walls was listening, watching, and communicating. David tried to be rational, claiming it was some kind of chemical reaction in the wallpaper or even a cruel prank by the previous owners, but Sarah could see the panic swimming behind his eyes. That night, when the kids were asleep, he whispered to her, "If it can predict, what happens when it decides what happens next?" His words haunted Sarah more than the walls did. Because the truth was, the house wasn't just reflecting. It was directing. The following evening, the predictions became unavoidable. On the wall near the kitchen door, the pattern writhed and twisted until words appeared in bold strokes. "Emma will scream." Emma was in the next room coloring quietly at the table. Sarah's heart lurched. She rushed to her daughter, scooping her up and looking frantically around for danger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, one of the overhead light bulbs exploded with a sharp crack, showering the floor in sparks and glass. Emma screamed so loudly the sound tore through the whole house. Sarah froze, clutching her daughter, realization chilling her to the core. The house hadn't just predicted, it had created the conditions to make the prophecy true. By the time David ran in, the writing had already changed. The wallpaper shimmered, the words shifting like oil in water, forming a new sentence. "Ben will burn." The house was silent that night, too silent. Sarah tossed and turned, listening for creaks in the old beams, for wind against the windows, but nothing stirred. It was as though the entire structure was holding its breath. She finally drifted into a shallow sleep, but sometime past midnight, a sound snapped her awake. It wasn't a crash or a footstep, it was the faintest scratch, like a pencil dragged across paper. Heart pounding, she nudged David awake, and together they listened. The sound came from the hallway. David grabbed the flashlight, and Sarah followed, their bare feet whispering against the wooden floorboards. When the beam of light hit the wallpaper, Sarah gasped. The delicate floral patterns were shifting, curling like living vines. Then, right before their eyes, words appeared, scratched into existence by invisible hands. "Sarah will cry." The letters bled out of the design, glowing faintly in the dark. Sarah's mouth went dry. It's me," she whispered, staring at her own name. David swallowed hard but said nothing, jaw locked tight. They both stood frozen, expecting something to happen immediately, but the hallway remained still. Sarah touched her face, half expecting tears to already be there, but her cheeks were dry. For a moment, she convinced herself it was a sick coincidence, some old graffiti hidden in the pattern that just looked like words. But deep down, she knew better. The next morning, Sarah tried to shake it off, but every little moment gnawed at her nerves. When Emma spilled her juice across the kitchen table, Sarah snapped at her far more harshly than intended. Emma's wide eyes filled with tears, and suddenly Sarah's own chest tightened. Hot tears spilled from her eyes before she could stop them. She cried, hard, uncontrollably, her hands trembling as David rushed over to comfort her. And in that instant, she realized it, the wall had been right. The prediction had come true. Later that evening, Sarah crept back to the hallway, staring at the wallpaper like it was an enemy. To her horror, new words had begun forming where the old ones had faded. This time, the letters sprawled larger, smeared across the wall like blood seeping through fabric. "Fire." Her stomach dropped. Not a memory, not a secret. A future. For 2 nights, the word fire burned in Sarah's mind, poisoning every thought. She refused to light candles, unplugged the toaster, even checked the stove knobs 3 times before bed. Still, the wallpaper never changed. It was as though the house itself was waiting, biding its time. On the 3rd night, while a storm raged outside, Sarah sat in the living room with the kids huddled under a blanket, the TV murmuring static after the signal cut out. David had gone upstairs to check a leak when a sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house. Not the storm rattling the shutters. Not tree branches scraping. A knock, 3 slow, heavy raps that seemed to shake the front door. Sarah froze. The children clung to her sides, their small fingers digging into her arms. Nobody should have been out there. The road to their property was washed out, and they hadn't had a visitor in weeks. Forcing herself to stand, Sarah approached the door, each step muffled under the rolling thunder. The knock came again, harder this time. She reached for the handle, then hesitated, because something caught her eye. The wallpaper in the hallway, half visible in the lightning flashes, was shifting again. Words rippled to the surface like bruises rising on skin. "Don't let him in." Her blood turned to ice. Her hand hovered over the handle as the knocking grew more insistent, pounding in a rhythm like a heartbeat. Then, from the other side, came a voice. Low, muffled, almost familiar. "Sarah," it whispered, dragging her name into a hiss. She stumbled back, pulse hammering in her ears. "Who is it?" she demanded, though her voice cracked with fear. The storm drowned out any reply, but she swore she heard laughter, a dry, broken chuckle that didn't sound human at all. The children whimpered, and Sarah dragged them away from the door. Upstairs, she heard David calling, "Who's there?" as he leaned over the stairwell, but before she could answer, the house itself seemed to roar. The wallpaper stretched and bulged as though something inside was trying to push through. The words shifted violently, smearing into a new sentence. "He is already inside." Sarah whipped around, scanning the living room, the kitchen, the corners where the light didn't reach. The door was still closed. The lock was still bolted. And yet, the house had never lied. The warning bled across the hallway, "He is already inside," and the house seemed to hold its breath with us. Rain rattled the windows like 1,000 fingernails, Thunder rolled through the ribs of the place, and the doorknob quivered in its latch as if whatever waited outside could simply vibrate its way through. Sarah backed away, dragging Emma and Ben with her, the three of them moving like one creature startled mid-step. Upstairs, David's footsteps pounded, then paused at the top of the stairs. "Sarah," he called, voice tight. "Who is it?" The answer came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a whisper that didn't use air or throat, a sound that traveled through plaster and lath, the house's voice, thin as paper, "Don't let him in." The front door rattled once, a polite little tremor that felt worse than a battering ram. Something about the restraint made it more human, more knowing. Sarah forced herself closer, close enough to press her eye to the peephole. There was only rain. The porch light haloed the storm into a soft white noise. The steps beyond were empty. She held her breath until her lungs burned, and in that oxygen-starved quiet she heard it, a low chuckle right by the wood, too close to be outside, too large to be a single throat. She jerked back. The lock stayed bolted. The knock stopped. The silence that followed was packed tight with a kind of waiting. David descended, jaw set, the old fireplace poker clutched white-knuckled in his hand. He took one look at the wallpaper and went paler than the lightning. "What did it say before that?" he asked, voice low. "Before already inside?" Sarah swallowed. "It told me not to let him in." David's gaze flicked to the door, then to the children, then back to the words. Some calculation settled in his eyes, fear braided with resolve. "Okay," he said, steadying his breath. "Then we don't. We sit tight. We..." 3 knocks sounded again, but not from the front door. They traveled through the floor under their feet, dull and deliberate, as if knuckles rapped on wood from inside the crawlspace beneath the house. Ben flinched so hard his teeth clicked. Emma whimpered and burrowed herself under Sarah's arm, the small animal heat of her making Sarah's courage feel both heavier and more necessary. David reached down, pressed his palm to the floorboards. "It's under us," he said, and when he tried for a wry smile it collapsed halfway. "Mice with manners." "Don't," Sarah said. "Don't joke." Her own voice sounded foreign, too thin in the gargled dark. The house hummed like a tuning fork struck in a skull. Across the hall, the wallpaper began to shift again. The roses loosened their petals like they were exhaling. Vines unspooled into letters, not a sentence this time, but directives, appearing one after another along the baseboard as if the house were laying out a scavenger hunt only a fool would follow. Back door. Then, pantry wall. Then, scribed across the archway to the kitchen in a childlike hand that made Sarah's skin pebble, "Ask him about the matches." Her gaze found David's face as if pulled by string. "What does that mean?" she asked, and the sound was softer than accusation, edged with exhausted hope, the kind of pleading that believes there must be a reasonable explanation. He blinked, once, twice, like a man surfacing too fast. "I don't," he began, and then looked away. "I don't know." The house did not like that answer. The light in the entryway flickered twice and held steady again. Words feathered up the stairwell like soot blown from a grate. "He forgets the child's name." "Stop it," Sarah hissed at the walls before she could stop herself. David's head snapped back toward her, an injury flickering through his stance. "This is what it wants," he said roughly. "Us at each other's throats." His eyes, a little wild, lifted to the ceiling. "You hear that? Not tonight." But the ceiling only listened, and the thunder rolled. They followed the house's map anyway. Fear gives orders, the body obeys. In the kitchen, the back door stood still unlocked, rain painting watery constellations down the glass. Sarah wiped a clear circle with her sleeve. No one on the stoop. No footprints in the mud, until she looked lower, to the mat just inside the threshold. Wet shoe prints had been stamped into the fibers. Small prints. Barely larger than Ben's. "Did you go out?" she asked him too sharply. Ben shook his head, eyes on the floor, shoulders hitching. He was shaking. Whether from cold or something else, she couldn't tell. Pantry wall, David said, as if saying it aloud could make the words less ominous. The narrow pantry smelled of flour and old paper bags. Canned goods lined the shelves like metal soldiers. At the back, behind a row of dusty mason jars, the wallpaper had peeled into a vertical seam, a fat blister running from the baseboard to shoulder height. There, Sarah breathed. She set Emma back on her feet, put her hands on the girl's shoulders. "Stay with me. Don't move." David wedged the poker's tip into the seam and levered. The paper gaped with a wet sucking sound, revealing a slice of darkness, then a splintered wood panel beneath, with a smaller door cut into it. No knob, only a ring of old nail heads in a pattern like a halo. Ben's breath hitched into a tiny hiccup. The 3 knocks came again, but now they were close enough to feel in the teeth. David slid the poker into the tiny door's edge, pried, and the board wrenched free, dropping to the pantry floor with a clap that seemed to echo far too long. Behind it yawned a crawlspace, no larger than a doghouse and twice as foul, reeking of damp and mouse droppings and the peppery tang of old, scorched wood. The beam of the flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through dust motes. Something sat at the very back. A little heap of paper. He reached in and drew out a handful. Not paper. Pages. Notebooks, curled by humidity. More lay behind. He handed one to Sarah, and she opened it with the dread of a person lifting a sheet in a morgue. Cramped handwriting filled it. Her handwriting. Every line the exact tilt, the exact loop. She skimmed, pulse roaring, entries from years ago, long before they moved here, things she had scribbled and burned, confessions she hadn't even told the girl she used to be. "I lied. I kept it. I was afraid of what he'd do. I can't think the name without bringing him back." She dropped the book like it had bitten. Another lay beneath, ink bled through from the other side, but not her hand this time, blockier, masculine. "I never meant for the flames to catch. I only wanted to see the blue." Her gaze crawled up to David. His face had gone wooden. "Matches," she whispered. Rain hammered the roof like applause. "What matches, David?" "I was a kid," he said, voice scraping. God, Sarah, I was 13. It was a field. No one was hurt." The house disagreed. Letters crawled up the pantry wall beside his head, a bloom of text like mold. "Not true." Then, below it, a child's name the Carters did not recognize, each letter blooming like a bruise. Emma read it aloud softly, almost kindly, the way you speak an unfamiliar word. The sound of it cracked something invisible, the air went tight and mean, and the light bulb over the sink fluttered to black with a pop. In the brief dark, someone breathed in Sarah's ear who was not in the room. "He won't say it," the breath whispered. "He doesn't remember." She swung the flashlight, catching only the open crawlspace like a mouth. Inside, more heaps of notebooks waited, spines furred with mold, pages the color of old teeth. Not only theirs. Others. Piled decades deep. The house had been reading a long time. Behind her, Ben made a small sound, not pain so much as surprise. When she turned, he was staring at his hands. Wet words slid across his palms in thin strokes, ink blooming from nowhere, beating the way sweat beads. "Let him in." He blinked, then shook his hands like he could fling the words away. They smeared but did not vanish, only broke into new letters that reassembled across his wrists. Emma's lower lip trembled. "Mom?" Sarah's mouth was sand. "It's a trick," she said, and hated the way the sentence sounded like prayer. "Don't read it. Don't." 3 polite knocks, tap, 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 sounded inches from her face. Not from the door. From inside the pantry wall she had just opened. The little door shivered as if something had rapped it from the house's side, from within the thickness of the wall itself. The wallpaper along the seam fattened, stretched, took a sighing breath. David stepped between the children and the opening, raising the poker. "Stay back," he said, and the order was steady, quiet, the way a man says "I love you" without words. The seam unzipped further without hands touching it, paper parting like wet lips. Cold poured out, carrying the smell of lake water and extinguished candles. A narrow strip of darkness beyond deepened until it was not absence but presence, a dense, velvet black that seemed to absorb the flashlight beam and ring it in like a bell. From inside that blackness, someone whispered Sarah's name in her voice. "Sarah." It came with the odd, moist closeness of speaking into your own cupped hands. She felt it in her jaw more than heard it with her ears. Her bones recognized the mouth that made it. "Back away," David said again, but even as he said it, the house wrote over his shoulder in tidy script, "He can't see it." The letters were inked across the air itself for a heartbeat, then sank into wallpaper and vanished. Sarah stared past him. Something had leaned out of the dark to watch her. Not a face. Not exactly. A shape like her reflection on black water, features generalized by ripples, made of shifting ink and damp paper. It waited for her to name it, so it could belong to that name. Sarah lifted her hand without meaning to, and the thing in the wall lifted its echo of a hand. Her palm tingled. No, not tingled, itched, as if 1,000 tiny tips of quills pricked at the inside of her skin, writing from the wrong side. She looked down. A faint line lifted beneath the surface of her forearm, colorless as a scar swelling before it ripens, wriggling as if alive. The line bent itself into the start of a letter, an L? No. An O. The itch traveled, forming the curve slow and sure. "Mom?" Emma said, a child's question dilating into terror. "Your arm." Sarah couldn't speak. The next letter pushed up beneath her skin, a bubble of pale flesh that smoothed into shape as if pressed from underneath by careful, patient fingers. Her name floated on the tip of her tongue, but she understood suddenly and perfectly that if she said it aloud, the house would know how to finish the sentence. The pantry door breathed. The rain hushed, eager to hear. The word in her arm completed itself to OP, and pain lanced up to her shoulder like a hooked thread being pulled. Her hand jerked toward the seam of the wall, the invisible command shaping her tendons. "Open." She clamped her fingers into a fist and squeezed hard enough to make her nails break skin. The thing in the wall smiled with her mouth. Somewhere deep in the house, under the floor or inside the walls or in the black between joists, someone laughed once, delighted. The wallpaper along the hallway flared with 100 new sentences at once, too many to read, a blizzard of script all saying the same word in different hands, in block letters in cursive and childish crayon loops. "Open. Open. Open." Sarah shut her eyes against all of it and said, hoarse and shaking, to the room, to the wall, to the thing that wore her, "No." The house answered by writing the missing letter inside her skin. And the pain bloomed. The air in the master bedroom was thick, almost syrupy, as if the oxygen itself had turned heavy and reluctant to be breathed. Sarah's body trembled against the doorframe, her eyes darting across the room where the wallpaper stretched like flesh, veined and swollen, pulsing faintly with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a human heartbeat. Each throb seemed to echo in her own chest, as though the house was sinking itself to her body, pulling her closer into its design. She wanted to scream, to wake David and Emma, but the silence in the air was not natural, it was purposeful, predatory, waiting for her to speak so it could answer back. Her hand brushed the wall unconsciously, and a jolt of icy electricity surged through her arm. She recoiled instantly, but not before the wallpaper bloomed with a ripple of text where her palm had rested. "You are mine now." The words faded slowly, melting back into the intricate floral patterns, but she could still feel them beneath her skin, etched into her veins like ink tattoos. She cradled her hand against her chest, terrified that when she opened her fingers again, the words would be carved there, raw and bloody. Down the hallway, a creak echoed, too deliberate to be the settling of old wood. Sarah froze, her body rigid, ears straining. It wasn't David. He snored like a train when he slept, and Emma, when restless, usually cried softly before padding across the hall to their room. This sound was heavier, dragging, as though something with weight and intent moved just beyond her sight. She dared a whisper, her voice so low it barely escaped her lips. "Who's there?" The wallpaper answered, cruel in its timing. Across the wall to her right, letters unfurled in a slanted, dripping script, already inside. Sarah stumbled backward, her heel knocking into the edge of the bed. Panic flooded her bloodstream, wild and hot. She lunged for the nightstand drawer, yanking it open to grab the flashlight they kept for power outages. Her trembling hands barely managed to click it on, its thin white beam cutting through the darkness. She swept it across the room, into the hallway, nothing. No figure, no intruder, only empty shadows. And yet, she could feel it. The undeniable sensation of being watched pressed against her back, coiling into her neck like cold fingers. She forced herself down the hall toward Emma's room, heart slamming with every step. The house seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, the wallpaper's patterns shifting as though they were trying to peel away from the plaster and wrap themselves around her ankles. By the time she pushed Emma's door open, she was shaking violently, the flashlight beam dancing erratically across the walls. Emma sat upright in bed, wide awake, staring at the wall across from her. Sarah's stomach dropped when she followed her daughter's gaze. The wallpaper was alive with movement, writhing as if thousands of words were trying to force themselves out at once, pressing against the surface from the inside. But only one phrase had successfully broken through, stretching long across the length of the wall. "Mommy doesn't leave." Emma turned her head slowly, her eyes glassy and strange. "The house told me that," she whispered, her voice almost cheerful. "It said you belong here now." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. She wanted to scoop Emma up, run, smash through a window if she had to. But when she stepped forward, Emma's tiny hands shot out, pressing firmly against her mother's chest. "No, Mommy," she said firmly, shaking her head. "The house gets angry when you try to leave. It told me it will make me go away if you keep trying." Tears burned Sarah's eyes. She wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter, but even as she held her, she could feel Emma's pulse racing unnaturally fast. The walls throbbed again, in rhythm with Emma's heartbeat, as though the house was tethered directly to her child's life. Sarah realized then, with a cold certainty, that this wasn't just about secrets anymore. The house wasn't satisfied with watching. It was feeding, binding itself to them, one life at a time. The flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging the room into suffocating black. In that darkness, the wallpaper glowed faintly, lines of words slithering across it like luminous worms. They crawled faster and faster, weaving together into new phrases. Sarah held Emma tighter, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she read the glowing sentence aloud, unable to stop herself. "Tonight the house chooses." And then the light in the hallway snapped on by itself. Sarah whipped her head around. A figure was standing there in the glow. Tall. Familiar. David. But his face wasn't right. Sarah's lungs froze as the figure in the hallway leaned forward into the light. At first glance, it was David, her husband, her partner, her safety net in this nightmare, but something about the way he held himself was wrong, grotesquely off. His head tilted too far, his shoulders slumped as if a puppeteer's strings held him upright rather than muscles and bone. His eyes, when they locked on hers, were vacant pools reflecting nothing but the sickly yellow glow of the overhead bulb. "David?" Sarah's voice cracked, betraying the terror she wanted to keep hidden from Emma. "Is that you?" The figure's mouth stretched into a smile, too wide, too thin, too deliberate. It moved slowly, step by dragging step, into the room. The floorboards groaned beneath its weight, each creak louder than the last, until Sarah realized the sound didn't fade into silence between steps. The groan lingered, as though the wood itself were crying out in pain, protesting his very existence. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "That's not Daddy," she whispered, her tiny voice trembling. "Mommy, that's not Daddy." The words carved ice into Sarah's chest. She wanted to believe her daughter was wrong, that stress, fear, and shadows were twisting reality into a cruel hallucination, but the truth was there in the thing's every movement. David never shuffled like that. David never bent his knees at strange, stilted angles, or let his arms dangle as though they didn't belong to him. And David didn't smile without his eyes. The wallpaper confirmed her dread. Across the wall behind the figure, fresh words bled through the floral pattern like ink soaking through fabric. "Say goodbye." Sarah's throat tightened. She set Emma down gently behind her, shielding her with her body. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, forcing her voice louder, braver than she felt. The figure stopped in the center of the room. Its head tilted again, this time almost completely sideways, neck bones popping in an unnatural crack. The smile didn't waver. Slowly, methodically, it raised one trembling hand and pointed a long finger at Emma. Sarah's scream tore out before she could stop it. "No!" She lunged forward, grabbing the nearest object she could, a lamp from Emma's nightstand, and hurled it at the figure. The lamp shattered against its chest with a burst of glass and sparks. The figure staggered backward, jerking violently like a puppet with tangled strings. Its head snapped upright, mouth gaping open, and a sound poured out. It wasn't David's voice. It wasn't even human. It was the house itself. The walls shook as the sound reverberated, low, guttural, endless. The wallpaper writhed, words spilling in frantic cascades. "Stay. Stay. Stay." Over and over, hundreds of times, wrapping the walls in a suffocating mantra. Sarah grabbed Emma, clutching her against her chest, trying to drown out the sound, but it pushed into her skull like a drill, vibrating her teeth and rattling her bones. And then, sudden silence. When Sarah dared to open her eyes, the figure was gone. Not vanished into air, but sucked backward, through the hallway wall as though the plaster were liquid. It left behind a dark smear on the wallpaper, like grease or blood, which slowly faded back into the floral design. The hallway stood empty. For a heartbeat, Sarah almost allowed herself to believe it was over. But then she saw the wall behind Emma's bed. New words had appeared there, stark and clear, written in a childlike scrawl that hadn't been there seconds before. "Mommy will go first." Sarah staggered backward, bile rising in her throat. She felt Emma's small hands clutch her sleeve, tugging with a desperation that mirrored her own. "Mommy," Emma whispered, "the house doesn't like you anymore." Sarah pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, tears spilling hot and fast. "Then we'll make it hate us both," she whispered back, her voice steel-edged with fear. She scooped Emma up in her arms, sprinted for the stairs, and didn't look back. But the house wasn't finished. As they reached the bottom step, every door in the house slammed shut at once with an air-splitting boom. The windows followed, their locks snapping into place as though controlled by invisible hands. The living room light flickered, and when it steadied, the wallpaper there had already shifted, covering every inch of the walls in one endless message. "There is no outside." Sarah froze, heart pounding, Emma trembling in her arms. She wanted to deny it, to scream back at the walls that they were wrong. But then she caught sight of the front door. It wasn't a door anymore. The wallpaper had spread across it like skin, sealing it seamlessly into the wall, erasing the very idea of an exit. For the first time, Sarah understood the real horror. The house wasn't keeping them trapped inside. The house had devoured the outside world completely. And it was still hungry. Sarah stood frozen in the living room, Emma's weight clinging to her chest, as the wallpaper's suffocating words wrapped around them like a noose. "There is no outside." The words weren't still, they moved across the wall on looping trails, rewriting themselves as if the house were breathing them into existence. Each new phrase slithered downward, dripping like ink, staining the floral pattern with dread. Her instinct screamed at her to keep running, to bash at the sealed door, to claw her way through plaster and wood until her hands were nothing but torn flesh. But deep down, she already knew. The door was no longer a door. The house had swallowed it whole. Emma tugged at her shirt. "Mommy," she whispered, "I think the house is reading us again." Sarah glanced down at her daughter. Emma wasn't pointing at the walls this time, she was pointing at the ceiling. Sarah tilted her head upward, and the sight made her knees buckle. Every inch of the ceiling was alive. Words right there in pulsating veins, glowing faintly with a sickly, greenish light. Unlike the scrawls on the walls, these weren't random. They formed sentences, long, detailed, precise. And as Sarah's eyes tracked across them, she realized with mounting horror that she was reading her own thoughts. She wants to run. She wants to protect Emma. She thinks the door can still be broken. She is wrong. Her breath caught. The words continued without pause. She will discover the truth too late. She will see what Emma already knows. The house doesn't want them to leave, it wants to finish reading them. Sarah pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle a sob. "No, no, no, no," her voice broke. "Emma, don't look. Don't read it." But Emma had already buried her face in her mother's shoulder, as if she knew more than Sarah dared admit. Suddenly, the walls themselves began to ripple, the wallpaper flexing like skin stretched too tight. From the corner of the room, a bulge formed, swelling outward as though something enormous pressed from the other side. The floral pattern distorted, stretched, then tore wide open. A hand emerged. It wasn't a human hand. It was made of wallpaper, thin, papery layers peeling back to form fingers, each edge curling like burnt parchment. It groped blindly at the air, then slammed into the floorboards with a hollow thud. Another followed, then another. Sarah backed toward the staircase, clutching Emma tighter. But before she could move further, the words on the ceiling shifted, reordering themselves into a fresh message. "Running is pointless. The house is already inside you." The air grew heavy. Sarah gasped, suddenly choking on a taste she hadn't noticed before: dust, plaster, mold, paper. It filled her lungs like smoke. She coughed violently, stumbling, feeling as though the house was pouring itself down her throat. Emma clung to her, sobbing. Then Emma whispered something that nearly made Sarah drop her. "Mommy, it's already finished reading me." Sarah froze. "What?" "No. Baby, what do you mean?" Emma's small hands trembled against her. "I saw it on my wall. It wrote everything about me. My favorite toys. My secret dreams. Even the bad things I've done. It knows everything." And then it said, her voice cracked. "It said my ending." Sarah's chest constricted. "No. Don't say it. Don't you dare." But Emma's words came anyway, barely audible through her tears. It said, "I disappear." Sarah's scream ripped through the house, raw and primal. She spun toward the staircase, desperate for anywhere, any room to hide, any chance to fight. But halfway up the stairs, Emma's weight grew lighter. Too light. Sarah looked down. Her daughter's arms were still looped around her neck, but they were no longer solid. Emma's skin was pale, translucent, her outline fading like chalk washed away by rain. "No! Emma! Stay with me!" Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching desperately, but her hands passed through her daughter's dissolving form as though grasping smoke. Emma's wide, terrified eyes met hers one last time. "I'm sorry, Mommy." And then she was gone. Sarah collapsed against the stairs, sobbing into empty air, her body shaking with grief so violent it left her gasping. But the house wasn't merciful enough to give her time. The ceiling blazed with new words, scorching into her vision like fire. "Now it's your turn." The walls groaned. The floor split open in jagged cracks. Out of them rose shapes, figures molded from torn wallpaper, stitched together from shadows, their faces blank except for mouths painted with words. Dozens of them. Hundreds. All surrounding her. Sarah staggered to her feet, tears blurring her vision. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. She wanted to fight, but against what? The house wasn't a place, it was alive, infinite, and patient. As the figures closed in, one stepped forward, taller than the rest. Its face wasn't blank. Its face was hers. Her own eyes stared back at her, cold and lifeless. Her own mouth curled into a smile. And from that mouth came the house's voice, booming, echoing, final. "We have read you. Now you belong to us." Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but before the sound could escape, the wallpaper surged forward like a tidal wave, wrapping around her, pressing into her skin, sinking into her lungs. Her vision dimmed, and for one last moment she saw words racing across the ceiling in a frenzy, faster than she could read. And then, silence. The living room was empty. The wallpaper returned to its quiet floral pattern. The cracks in the floor sealed. The air stilled. The house stood waiting, patient, its story complete. Until the next family arrived.